Okay, so the thing I'd say is, although Devon, that was a great introduction, I feel like there's something more we should say about Nitesh while he's here. So in 1994, correct me if I make mistakes, by the way. In 1994, the government put out a thing saying Manor has to close down. And that time, Nitesh was only 18 years old. And he thought, we can't close my place of spiritual worship down. And so, as any 18-year-old does, he sat on the top of a van with a megaphone and started campaigning. And his campaigns were quite successful. They had thousands of people outside Westminster protesting for this spiritual sanctuary. And in the end, the manor still exists today. So Nitesh played a massive part of that through his revolutionary kind of protesting. And then along with that, he has kind of experience in the world of high finance, a great place of the glorious lands of investment banking, and then later went on to become the CEO of Avanti Schools. So the Avanti Schools are brilliant. He basically, when I asked him about it, he said like he had a kid and he was like, I can't find a school good enough for my kid. So he made one. And I don't know, if anything is aura, that statement right there should be enough aura. And both of his sons have gone through that schooling system. They're now in the other world of Oxford. I can't support Oxford, but I'm sure the people can appreciate it. But we're very grateful to him for actually taking his time out to come here and be with us. And on top of that, he's a really, really good philosopher. So if we're struggling, just like empathize with us a little bit because we're dealing with someone that's really, really good in their field. I think if we want to start off the discussion, we were thinking of asking you, if you had to explain God to a 5-year-old, how would you do that?
Just to give me a little bit of time thinking about that strange question. Um, yeah, so I was going to actually say that. Well, first of all, it's great to be here. This was, we did our very first KCSOC. The very first KCSOC event was at UCL in 1994 or 95. That was a debate between a physicist, Dr. Bernard Saul, and Shivam Sami, and that was on the existence of God. So it's good to be back in the same place. Okay, how do you explain God to a 5-year-old? The thing is, I actually know lots of 5-year-olds in our schools. I think it's a lot easier to explain it to a 5-year-old than it is to explain it to a 20-year-old at university, because I think, except for Avanti, of course, the education system at large somehow manages to squeeze out the intuitive sense, common sense, that we can have in our connection with the world, nature, how we deal with and think about reality. So I know, obviously, I don't want that to come across as naive, just in terms of our understanding of the world. Clearly, we develop different faculties and levels of depth in which we think about stuff, right? So as we get older, but there is an intuitive level of understanding that a child has. So actually explaining God is not that complicated, in the sense that it's quite natural for them to understand that in terms of there being something greater. Now, that may not be located in personal experience, but in terms of the example that they draw to come to that understanding, where there's a creation, there's a creator type thing as a simple example, it's quite intuitive. So most children, and also when we think about God as we get older, we're thinking about it from the perspective of, very like a very complex way of thinking about God. Whereas for children, God could be a friend, right? I mean, God could be so many things that's much more immediate to them, as opposed to something that's very far away and distantly located. I remember when I was in primary school, and there was I don't know if they still have it. It's called News Round. I still have News Round, yeah. So I remember quite vividly, actually. I must have been about 7 or 8. So I was watching this News Round program, and this presenter was saying that they asked children from around the world about God, and they said that one of the things that they noticed, which was interesting for them as they were reporting it, was that when they asked children in the Western world, where is God? Typically they would point in the sky and they say it's somewhere in the sky. Maybe that's like Sistine Chapel type stuff. And when they asked children in the East, typically they'd point inside. So it was quite interesting, like how children, based on their cultural kind of situation, context, stories, etc., think about God. But and that's why, like from a Vedic philosophy perspective, I'm not a philosopher, by the way, but from a Vedic philosophy perspective, God's both, right? Is I am ourselves. So I think children get it.
Could you elaborate a little bit on what you mean by God is both on the inside and outside?
Oh, okay. So so the Vedic philosophy has this idea, concept, image of God, which is very nuanced and detailed. So it goes into quite a lot of detail in terms of the identity of God, God's energies, and how God engages with the world, but very broadly at the kind of highest level of categorization, if you like. The Vedic philosophy speaks about three aspects of God, that God can be understood or spoken about in three ways. And what's interesting, actually, they don't use the term God, like because the Vedas do start from a philosophical perspective as opposed to a religious perspective. So they come in the kind of beginning steps of introducing the topic. They're talking about ultimate reality. So that ultimate reality can be conceived of and spoken about in these three broad aspects. So they talk about that from the perspective of an impersonal, energetic aspect, an aspect that is indwelling within every living being, and an aspect that is transcendent and personal. So these are the three ways in which the Vedic philosophy kind of at its highest level categorizes the way in which we can engage with ultimate reality.
Okay, so I think when we start off with like discussions about arguments for the existence of God, the first one, the kind of more intuitive stuff that you talked about was something like design, right? Like there's things in the world, and so there must be a person that made those things. Yeah, as a very basic argument.
Yeah.
You know, like William Paley does it in a much more esoteric way. He says, like, if you were to walk in a field and you were to see a watch, you would think that someone made that watch. But when you look around in the world around you, do not think a person made that as well. So, how many of you have heard of this kind of design argument by now? Sure. Yeah. How many of you are convinced by this kind of thing? A couple? It seems like intuitively convincing, but it feels like kind of too simple. So we wanted to ask, like, what do you think about kind of argument from design? Does it seem to make sense?
I think there is a intuitive kind of connection with the argument. I don't know if it's so philosophically robust. I think there are lots of ways that you could counter the argument. So the Vedic philosophy doesn't really accept it as a strong argument. So it is used just for kind of general explanation, and it's kind of a helpful, perhaps, kind of way to enter the conversation about just getting us to think about the potential of that. But I think, for example, you could object in the sense that, yeah, but there's nothing to say that creator is God. There's nothing to say that there's only one creator. There are all kinds of other objections that could be posed to that. So I think sometimes what happens is in this type of argument, you can get into a lot of technicality about one way or the other. But the Vedic approach doesn't really put too much weight on that type of argument because there are gaps in it. There are ways to counter it. But it's helpful just in terms of providing some degree of, orientation towards that, towards the idea of is there a God or not. So, yeah.
You kind of touched on it, but you said that there's a counter argument of is there one God? Are there multiple? So could you maybe answer that question as well? Like,
would you say that there's one designer, or is it a collaboration thing that's happening?
It's a group project, maybe.
Project.
Yeah, I mean, look, that's why the Vedic philosophy comes in the perspective of ultimate reality, because it's not, the Vedic philosophy is not naive or silly in that sense. That however, like we in our own mind, kind of the tiny speck that we occupy on this earth, there's a tiny speck in the cosmos and all that kind of stuff. Trying to imagine what that looked like pre-time, right? So before time came into existence, what did that look like, and what does a potential ultimate reality look like? We can only how far we can get from that perspective, just in terms of trying to grasp those truths. So yeah, it doesn't get into it from that perspective. So the philosophy, before we get to the theology, before we get to the religion bit, which is quite clear about the nature of God in terms of that transcendent personality, in terms of the third aspect of ultimate reality I spoke about earlier, and getting into that. But just before that, this notion that, well, what is the ultimate reality? What is it in its kind of ultimate sense? So you can always make the argument, right? So if somebody made a watch, and you go back, right? So who made the watch? You ask, well, who made the person who made the watch? You go back and back and back and back, right? And then if you get to the place where you say, well, there were 10 guys who actually, and girls, who got together and created the universe, then obviously the question is, well, who made them, right? And then that's the question that is sometimes posed to the point about, well, if you insist upon a cause, then, well, it's gone. So that's why I don't think the multiplicity of gods, whilst there may be a secondary creation thing going on, right? So in terms of, we're all, in that sense, if you define God as the creator, we're all God to a limited extent, right? So if God is a controller, God is the creator, all of those types of things, then we're all little gods running around, and we make and create to our little capacity. We invent stuff, we control little domains that we control, all of that thing. So, okay, but then who's the, Abdul Swami said, there are many clerks. So who's the head clerk? Right, so that's why his term for God is Godhead. So it's like, yeah, we're all little gods running around, but it's the Godhead. Right? So that's why, yeah, go down that route, but it leads to an absurd conclusion.
I think like talking about cause and like how you've mentioned you can't infinitely go back. So there's an argument for like some kind of first cause is that someone may say the universe seems to have arisen due to just chance, like the Big Bang just happened, and I don't know, however many billion years later, here we are now. So is there a need for causality? Is causality even real? Because couldn't you just argue that this is all just probability, and there is just some kind of weight of a certain probability that each and every eventuality happens?
Okay, so let's get to the crux of it, because there's a lot in that. So in terms of causality, the Vedic philosophy says that ultimate reality is sarva-karana, which means the cause of all causes. So that there is a prime cause. There is a first mover, if you like, in Western philosophy. So now, why does it need to be a first mover? Why does it need to be a first cause? So if you now, to your point about can it not just be chance? So just to clarify this point. So when you use words like chance or use words like randomness, let's use randomness, slightly more kind of scientific connotation to it. You are explaining, or you are describing something. So it's a description of a phenomena that you're observing. You are not explaining anything. So if anybody says something happened by chance or it's just random, there is zero explanation in that statement. It's a completely unscientific explanation. Like there is no explanation. There's no science in the explanation. There is, like in terms of the distribution curve, right? So there's science in the phenomenon that I'm observing. So it's coming out as a random distribution. But I'm not saying anything about the cause in that statement. Do you understand? So if that's the case, then causality cannot be explained by chance or by randomness. You can say that I'm observing something that looks like randomness because that's what the curve is doing, but I'm saying absolutely zero about the causality. So when we talk about chance in that sense, because I think this is like a big misunderstanding or misnomer, which a lot of people lean on because they believe that science has brought us to the point that allows us to say that causality is based on randomness, and that's just not true. It's just like philosophically, if you use chance as a cause, you are making a philosophical statement, an incorrect philosophical statement, but philosophical rather than a scientific one.
It's out of the realms of science.
Well, look, think about it this way, right? So, if I came late to this session, and then you say to me, "Well, why were you late?" and I said, "Well, it was chance." But you're not gonna be okay with that.
No.
You're gonna want to know why. So then, did your car break down? Did you miss the train? Did you whatever it was, right? So why? Because the problem with saying it was chance is that as soon as somebody says it's chance that caused this, now what happens is you stop the process of scientific inquiry. Because if you ask me, why did ABC happen? And I say it happened by chance. Science is all about trying to find the truth. It's the search for underlying truth, right? But you can't ask why if I say chance. So you've stopped the process of inquiry.
One of the things you talk about in your book is about this topic of chance. But intuitively, right? I don't know. I'm flipping a coin. Right? Is it not a 50-50 chance that it's heads or tails?
If you flip the coin, it's a 50-50 chance. If I have a machine here that is perfectly configured to flip coins, and I can control everything in that machine, angle, spin, momentum, air pressure, all of that stuff, I can control for it. And I set it to flip heads, what will it be?
Heads.
Every single time. Yeah. Right? And there are machines that do that every single time. So where's the chance gone? Where's chance gone? It's disappeared.
Yeah.
Why? Because I have now control for the cause, the real cause. All you're seeing when you see the 50-50 is what I was talking about, the distribution. You see a random distribution. So you're then applying that phenomenon of observation, you're backwards engineering it into causality, which doesn't work.
Right.
You're reading something there that's not causality.
So, like, hypothetically, you could model, like, the amount of force I put with my finger, I didn't like the air pressure in the room, the weightage of the coin, the surface it lands on. You could model all of those things. You'd be able to accurately explain what happens every flip. Because, I mean, there's all those factors getting into it. There are machines that do that. Yeah.
They exist.
If you were to take this same idea though, and let's take it to something that maybe we're going through on a day-to-day basis. For example, I get a job offer that I was like waiting for, and I'm so excited that I got it. But then the next day or a week later, the offer's taken away from me. They have better people in the company. I don't know. But when we see those things happening, is that because of God?
Is it because of God?
Is it because
Because he's the cause of all-
because he's the cause of all causes, right?
Uh-huh.
So could you not say that
Oh, I see.
that the
It's his
cause
fault.
of all causes took away my job offer?
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, what you're coming at here is the problem with evil, right? So, this notion that is particularly prominent in the Western world around a lot of people having a problem believing in God because why do good people suffer type of argument, right? Is that similar to where you're going with that? Yeah, okay. So there have been lots of responses in terms of theodicy, in terms of how do we explain God's well, okay, so for those of you who are not familiar, the idea is that, well, if there is a God, then surely God is omnibenevolent, so he's all good, he's all powerful, right? So if bad things happen to people, either he's not all good or he's not all powerful, right? He can't be both. And bad things happen to good people, right? So that doesn't stack up. So that is problematic in many respects. I think a lot of people, religious and atheistic, would point to this argument as the most biggest or most powerful argument for why they don't believe in God. So it's a big deal. It actually has a lot less significance and weight in Vedic philosophy. And the reason for that is because Vedic philosophy doesn't have God as the only actor or as the only mover. So the idea of the first mover is to set things in motion, if you like. And then there are natural laws which exist. And we, as individual, let's call ourselves units of consciousness. So we, as individual units of consciousness, possess free will. And we exercise that free will according to ways in which are dictated or chosen according to our preferences, prejudices, all the rest of it, our conditioning, essentially. And we traverse that journey over lifetimes. So there is an understanding that every action is not just random, that there is causality behind it, but that link between cause and effect is so difficult to make clear over long periods of time, because and that's clear just if you take any cause and effect, even in the immediate, it's very difficult to connect cause and effect. So this is difficult to do. Therefore, we can't connect why I lost my job to something that I did. So, but we know that every cause has an effect. We know that there is, but we're not able to connect every single act to an effect. Right?
Can I explain a little bit? So you said like, if I do something, and then there's some time before there's an effect, right? So I don't know, if I clap, you've seen the action of me clapping and heard the sound of it instantly. So it's quite easy to go, okay, that sound came because I clapped. What kind of circumstances are you talking about where there's a cause and effect that comes after some period of time?
Anything, right? So even a clap. So because it's not instant. Okay. So the example I use is of an echo. So an echo is a little bit more distant because the sound is coming from a separate, a distant place. Yeah. And there is a time delay of a couple of seconds. So wherever time and space, right, cause and effect are distanced by time and space. So in the echo, you can think about it being distanced in terms of space because it's coming from the mountain, and it's distance in terms of time because there's a 2-second delay in it coming back to you, okay? So wherever there is time and space, increase the gap between cause and effect, then you're going to have a problem connecting the two.
Because like if I clap now, and then I hear a clap coming from like outside of the room, 20 seconds later, it would be very hard for me to put the two.
It's a problem. Great.
But what I wanted to ask was, for example, maybe I won't use you as an example. I'll use you as an example. If you're walking and let's just say you sprain your ankle, and I feel so sorry for you because in the past I've sprained my ankle and I understand that feeling, but I'm not you, so I won't feel that pain, right? So in that same way, how can we understand this idea of cause and effect? Like things are happening to us, but does God understand what we're feeling? Because He saw us. So could you help me with that?
Yeah. So one interesting way in which the Vedic philosophy encourages us to think about this, of who we are in connection with, right, or in relation to that ultimate reality, because I think that is what's behind the question, is so we're individual units of consciousness. So one thing that I know is that I experience something myself. I also know, and from my observation of the world, that other people, there are other units of consciousness inhabiting this world, and they seem to experience things in the way that I experience them. So I can't be sure of that because I can't see from their perspective, but I can guess that. So I know that I experience what I experience. I don't experience what you you experience, and vice versa. So, so the question is in relation. So, if there are units of consciousness, what the Vedas ask us to question is what is the source of that unit of consciousness? So, there are many examples given. So, like if you think about the energetic or the energy, and one nice example is the sun and the sun ray. So the idea is that the units of consciousness are like sun rays, but there is an origin which is the sun, and that's the thing which has the common consciousness throughout, and therefore the ultimate reality talks about these three dimensions. We'll go back to again. So this kind of impersonal or non-personal, energetic aspect, and an indwelling aspect within every living being, which is the thing which allows that connection. Because think about it, I know that I'm different from you, and yet I know that there is something similar. So what is it that is binding? What is it that is common? And how is that related? And that's why Vedic thought supports us in that direction. There are individual units of consciousness. What is the source of that consciousness? That source of consciousness is that which inhabits every living being. So in the way that you were asking, like how does God?
You know how you talked about this Vedic philosophy talks about approaching ultimate reality, right? So like Vedanta begins with its whole inquiry about, now let's try and inquire about that which is the ultimate reality. It's quite, I think it's easier to see the kind of connection from ultimate reality when I'm looking at my own identity. To go, right, there's like, how would I identify myself? Let's say I'm a student, I'm studying econ, I'm at this university, these are my hobbies. To go to a deeper level, I could go, well, this body is my identity. And then to go a little bit more than that, I can see this body's animated by consciousness. So I think it's easy to see like ultimate identity as consciousness to some extent. But to make the jump from consciousness to some kind of super consciousness or impersonal force or divine energy or something like that seems to be like somewhat less scientific, and it seems to require some sort of faith. So how would you kind of explain that approach? Because it's like the inquiry beginning to look for ultimate reality is fine, but navigating that journey itself seems a little bit more experiential, faith-based, or some things.
So I think that's right. I mean, I think it is more of a theological proposition than it is about just identifying consciousness. So, and approaching that understanding is not pure. See, ultimately, philosophy will take you to a point of understanding, right? The whole point of philosophy is to try and do that, to try and bring us to deeper understandings, to even guide. I mean, I like to think about it as these kind of three concentric circles. There's philosophy, science, and religion. And where these three, if you read like a Venn diagram, where these three intersect is essentially where ultimate reality can be understood in its fullest sense. Because none of these three disciplines are going to be able to describe the entirety of that ultimate reality. So it's true, philosophy guides science, science guides philosophy. I mean, you know that, we've seen that over centuries. And from the Vedic philosophy in the Western world, of course, religion has often sat outside of that, especially in the last couple of 100 years, where religion is not seen as kind of has having anything to contribute to that conversation. Whereas in Vedic philosophy, much comes from the same text. So the science, the philosophy, and the theology are rooted in the same text. So then it's not like something has to be divorced from each other for it to point to truth. So it's true. There are some claims which are propositional from a philosophical perspective, some which are from a scientific perspective, and some which are from a theological perspective. So if you want to know about the nature of God and his personality, I mean, philosophy is not really going to get you there, right? And nor is science.
Can you see how that invites a lot of mysticism, cults, like a lot of dangerous things when you need the kind of realm of rationality and science? I mean, we've seen like historically what religion can do.
So then you have to remove from the world everything related to love, art, music. I mean, none of that is scientific.
How do you know it's real? How do you know any of it is real, right? Like, I could trust someone, but they could end up scamming me.
Okay, so that's true. I mean,
Example. Bad example, sorry.
I said like, how do you know it's real? I mean, how do you know any? If your point is how do you know anything is real, then you can't ask that question of God, because you're now doubting the existence of all these people in this room.
I think the difference is, like, the people in the room, they're more tangible. I can see them, I can speak with them. There's reciprocation that I can maybe get immediately.
Okay, so then the person who's sitting in the room on the other side of this wall, they don't exist.
I couldn't know that.
I wouldn't know that there's someone sitting there.
They could just be in the NPC room.
Okay. So there's nobody else in London except these people in this room. Is that okay? There's nobody in London. Everyone in London is just dropped dead, or they never existed at all. Forget London, the whole world. The only people in the whole universe are the people in this room. I mean, that's absurd. Right?
Yeah.
The argument doesn't fly.
Yeah, but I don't know why.
You don't know why.
Yeah, as in like I can't argue against it, if that makes sense.
Okay, that's good.
As in I just have to accept that people, I wouldn't be able to tell me from my
No, because I mean, the reason why you have to accept it, and maybe the audience can help you out, but I would say maybe we should actually turn to the audience on this. But I think, look, the reason why you know is because just in the same way that I don't know 100% that the sun is going to rise tomorrow.
Yeah.
Okay? Right. I'm pretty sure it is. So I don't know for sure that the whole world has just disappeared.
Yeah.
Except this room. But I'm pretty sure it hasn't.
We have some kind of reasonable faith based on
Yeah.
experience and whatnot.
So that's what the Vedic philosophy is doing. It's basically like don't mistake this. Okay, it's quite easy to fall into the trap of thinking that which I see and touch and feel, those things that are coming to me, my senses, are the only things that I can believe in. I know that there are some philosophical empiricists, basically, that philosophical tradition which have that notion. But truth and reality, we understand and accept from different places. And we know that our senses can also be deceived in many ways. We've seen optical illusions, for example. So is it true or is it not true? Just the fact that I saw it doesn't make it true.
How do you know something that's so far away then? For example, in this room right now, if I was wanting to know somebody, I could go up to them, have a conversation, right, and get to know them better. But with something like God, it seems so far away.
Yeah, well, like I said, some children point to the sky, some children point to the heart. So God could be very far away, or God could be closer than anyone, right? I mean, it depends on your perspective of how you want to engage with that ultimate reality, and ultimately these things come down to a process. Like, so you gave the example. If I want to understand that there is somebody behind that wall, I have to go out and I have to go there and I have to speak to them and make sure they're real and all the rest of it. Right? There's something that you're doing to find that out. So what religion stroke theology kind of adds to the process is like saying, okay, well, science and philosophy bring us to the point of saying this is a reasonable thing to explore. There are reasonable arguments for this to be true, but it takes a theological input, a religious input, to apply the process to actually coming to a conclusion on that. So that's what I mean by these three things working in conjunction with each other, because any one of these three will not be able to give you the full spectrum of truth or reality without these other components. They'll only be able to bring you to the threshold, right? So theology could bring you to the threshold of science, but like if you want to carry out a scientific experiment, you're going to need to get into the realm of science. And science has its own set of rules that that don't transfer into philosophy and into theology. And likewise for the other two. That was the point about chance. Like chance. Now, you're trying to make a scientific claim that about a philosophical point. It doesn't work.
So like, okay, with you explained before we go into like deeper epistemology. Epistemology is how you know what you know. It's the idea of like, how can I verify something is true? How can I know this to be true? And so one of the ways we can do it is through our own experience, through our senses. The Vedic literature talks about understanding, even if you can't directly interact with something, you can use your intelligence and put pieces together based off observation and your own inference. So like, I don't know. I know that these people are in this room because I see them, but I might see smoke from another room. And although I don't see the fire in that room, I can put pieces together and go, the last time I saw smoke, there was a fire. It wasn't very good. So I need to leave. There's a fire. So I've not seen the fire, but I've put pieces together to get to that. So I've used my intelligence, and that seems to be what the scientific method is trying to do. You kind of come up with a hypothesis, and then you empirically test that. But then there's also this idea of, I don't know what you call it, like kind of like revelation or taking knowledge on the strength of others. So maybe I see smoke in that room and then I see someone walking into this door and I go, hey, was there a fire in that room? And they go, yeah, there was actually. So then I can trust their opinion of it because they're like an authorized source. And so it seems to be that there's I'm having faith in that person's statement, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so there's a way of seeking truth that's kind of more faith-based. Can you kind of elaborate on that kind of approach?
Well, I mean, faith has different connotations to it. So like we're sitting in UCL right now. So this is a university. Generally, I guess there are students over there and then there is a professor over here. And the students are not doubting every single thing that the professor is saying. Right? I mean, you wouldn't get very far if you were to do that. So there are things that in any university, in any educational context, where we are accepting something that an authority is imparting to us. Now, we may then go and question aspects of that, of course, and but there is an element of faith in all of these processes, right? So, and the Vedic philosophy, that's to the point about theology. Like I was talking about something like, let's talk about like the nature of God. So if the Vedic theology now is talking about the nature of God, then that's talking about it from the perspective of a scriptural source, which has then been endorsed by a line of teachers who are then conveying that same message because they have some faith in that, or that's been their experience in their spiritual journey. So there's nothing wrong with accepting that on faith any more than there is from a student studying at UCL accepting something from the professor. The difference is that, is there a process to stop it becoming blind faith? Is there a process that allows you to verify what your professor is saying? Right? And that's where it's important for us to be able to identify what that is, and for any kind of spiritual exploration or journey to be something that is true for ourselves. And by true, I mean it's real. It's my truth. It's not. I'm not just borrowing faith from the person telling me, but I have a way and a mechanism to justify that belief for myself. And I think that's where you get the distinction between blind faith in religion and theology or whatever, and somebody who's actually trying to practice something with their intelligence turned on.
On that point, there's so many different religions and different paths that are out there. Then how can you know which one to trust, which one is authentic, which one's the best for me?
Yeah. So which chapter? Use chapter 2, where I talk about tests for religion. So like, how can you test from the outset whether this is something that you actually want to do, whether it's something that you want to explore? Because like you say, I mean, theoretically, there may be something like 5 or 6 main world religions, but within that, we know, of course, that there are unlimited kind of, ways in which you can engage with those or other forms of spirituality. So all of those are on offer, and you need some mechanism to try and create a funnel system, so that, because you're not, it's unlikely that you're going to dedicate yourself seriously to all of them. So how do you go down that funnel? Now, for most people, it's essentially the religion they were born into, which is the religion, if they follow any religion, the religion that they follow. Most people, obviously, there are people who switch across. For me, that's an interesting point, because it's like, well, does that mean that people are just following something without using their intelligence and questioning it? Because then, would you then expect a more equal, proportionate distribution, or is it that actually that's kind of natural because of other factors which have got to do with their exposure and upbringing and culture and all of those types of things, and therefore I guess for me the point is that the reason why the ways in which we identify whether something is worth pursuing are really important. And I think for me also even more important than the question about which religion is the question about, why do I want to follow a particular religion? Like, why is it that I want to explore this? Because I think locating that question is in many ways more important. It's not about who's got the best argument. Like, if you lined up all the religions and you were trying to score them, Christianity and Islam and Judaism and Hinduism, like, you try and score them and then say, well, the one with the highest score is the one that I'm going to go with. It's like, you can try.
Maybe we can do that next KCSOC for chunks.
You can try and be that objective about it, but the fact is that we come at these things from quite subjective roots, right? Like, we come at these because we have a certain encounter with that tradition that speaks to us in a deeper way than we can score on a score sheet. And that's what draws us to it. Some kind of experience, some kind of encounter, some kind of, it could be a conversation, it could be an observation of a form of their worship. It might be, somebody who inspires us from that tradition, whatever it is. And the Vedic philosophy boils down to, the perspective actually boils down to one thing, which is like, in who do you see this philosophy, these teachings embodied?
Yeah.
And in that person, are you willing to emulate? Are you wanting to, is inspiring you, is moving your heart? Interestingly, the word for faith in Sanskrit is Shraddha. And the word Shraddha actually means where I place my heart. That's the meaning of faith. Where I place my heart is the meaning of faith. And that's what we do when we come to a spiritual practice in a serious way, is that we're finding somewhere where we seek to place our heart. And that's what generates that feeling of faith and inspiration in that tradition.
But to that point also, I guess a doubt that I have is that so much changes over the years. Even when you look in the context of scriptures, what has been written many, many years ago or has changed in some minute way. And in that same way, people are also imperfect. So how do I know, how can you know that it's okay to place your trust?
Yeah, okay. So like, I'm not saying that you can't score them. Like, the tests I give are a form of scoring. So you can do that, right? I'm just saying, like, it's not so you can, for example, you could score all these traditions. How much have they changed over time since their origin? So you could do that, right? Like, if that's something that's really important to you, then that you want to see the original, authentic origin of that tradition, then yeah, maybe that's something that you want to kind of focus in on and give more weighting to in your scoring. But ultimately, that's not going to be the thing, the deciding factor, right? I mean, that's, you'd have to be pretty kind of automated to do that. So yeah, there are factors like that. There are factors like, another could be, what does this tradition actually offer? Like, what is it saying that if you perfect this tradition, this is what happens? And then it's like, well, do I even want that? Right? Because if I don't want that, then What's the point? Right? So and then are there living examples? What happens to those civilizations, for example, that have practiced this? One of the tests I quote there is about what is the nature of the civilization that comes from this tradition? What is the quality, the sophistication, the goodness of all of the things that come from that culture? And that you can see, like, from how they treat people outside of that tradition. What is its attitude to those people? What is the nature? Anyway, well, so many ways that you can approach that.
Because we're on a time crunch, we'll squeeze in one last question. And the question is, God is supposed to be fully satisfied. If that's the case, why would he create us and the world? God is referred to as being inconceivable, so why bother involving ourselves in something we'll never fully understand?
I mean, that's like saying, why do anything? Like, why study anything? You're not going to understand anything to this full capacity. To say that God is inconceivable, it's true. The Vedic philosophy says, absolutely, God is inconceivable, and he cannot be understood, and he cannot be approached unless he wants to be approached, unless he wants to be conceived, and that's his choice. So it's not a question of Vedic philosophy, again, is very clear. It's not to say that we can grasp at something like we can grasp at knowledge that we can do by our own power. That God is beyond that. Yet, clearly, if God is unlimited, we talked about benevolence and omnipresence and all-powerful. If he is truly omnipotent, if he is truly all-powerful, can he reveal himself to you? Right? I mean, to say that, no, he can't, like this is an argument that people often have with Vedic philosophy is, how can you approach God through a deity, right? Because the deity or the form carved out of stone limits God. But the point is, if God wishes to accept worship through a deity, is he able to do that? I mean, try saying he isn't. You see where you end up. As a conclusion, as a philosophical train of thought, where do you end up with that?
You created a limited God.
Right.
Yeah.
So these things, it's true, like in terms of his team. Sorry, I forgot the first part. What was the first part?
Why did he create us in this world?
If he's fully self-satisfied.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
If he's fully yeah. So this is actually a really interesting contribution of the Vedic philosophy, which is that we are co-creators of the world.
So we're mini gods?
Many gods. Like, the implications of this are really important.
I'm putting that on my LinkedIn.
So
Mini god.
many god. So the idea is that, God is created. Why did he create? So remember we were talking about this idea that in my own nature, I can see the same qualities that are magnified in God's nature, right? So free will is one of those things. I make a choice. So God has unlimited free will. I have limited free will, right? I wish I had unlimited, but I have limited free will. I experience that every day, right? So I experience those limitations. Now, free will by definition means I have a choice, right? I can choose. So therefore, this point about creation, the whole story, the whole kind of explanation of creation is based on consciousness, is based on a desire units of consciousness has, and God's reciprocation with those desires. So the notion of why would God create, it's twofold. And super interestingly, this is something which some very senior scientists are now speaking about in the context of the fundamental reality, not from a religious perspective, but the fundamental reality incorporates consciousness, and the process of the world is a process of consciousness discovering consciousness. I mean, it's unbelievable that they have, quite greatly to their credit, that they've come to this point of understanding, which the Vedic texts speak about, that actually it is consciousness revealing itself, consciousness which is exploring itself. And the way that the Vedic system and philosophy works is that you've seen, you know what fractal design is? So fractal design is essentially that which can be seen at a microscopic level is the same pattern which you see at the macroscopic level, right? So like, however you zoom in and out, it's kind of the same thing, but repeated. It's like, you can Google it, right? So, but essentially, the Vedic philosophy speaks about the nature of the universe and the forms of creation and the process of creation in quite a fractal way. So, for example, the Purusha is described at the beginning of creation. Now, people, when Western people went to India and they studied some of this stuff, they took it as a very primitive, naive form of religion, philosophy, because they didn't understand what was being said. So what was being said was they were thinking about this is the personification of the universe. It's a form of panentheism or pantheism, right? One or the other. It's like pantheistic. You're seeing the world as the body of God, or the cosmos as the body of God, and that's kind of an old-fashioned idea, and we reject it. Here's nice, clean monotheism for you primitive people. What they didn't get, what they didn't understand was being said is that the nature of the cosmos incorporates the fractal understanding. So by my own understanding of my body and my consciousness, I am reading into the nature of the universe. It's a very, very profound point. And it's at some point, like it would be great to speak about this how this actually works in terms of the fractal design, and how the cosmos and the individual body and the individual self are seen as a microcosm of the macrocosm, and the relation between the two. Because even in the process of Vedic ritual, the idea of creating, and the Vedic ritual is on a daily basis that we are, metaphorically speaking, creating the world every day. And again, this has huge ethical implications for how we see the world and engage with it.
So just to conclude, I think some of the really nice points you've mentioned were just now about how the inconceivable can be conceived to the point that the inconceivable reveals oneself. And so although we might not be able to completely conceive the inconceivable, we can gradually, through this process of theology or religion, actually begin to experience something of that. Right now, the point about the fractal and how one can understand something of the nature of the divine through the nature of the self, because the individual unit of consciousness has some property or qualitative similarity with the absolute truth. And I think fundamentally what is very different about the Vedic approach is that it doesn't try and assert things philosophically in the way that it doesn't begin with theology as a means of philosophical assertion to get to the theological point of view. I mean, it begins with a kind of a journey or a quest, a spiritual quest to actually seek truth, and then comes to theology as a conclusion of that journey. And the fact that that is a actual journey with those different steps, taking on faith, understanding that in a rational, direct, logical manner, and science, religion, and philosophy, all seeking truth in different ways, all working together to understand ultimate reality, is a very beautiful conception of spiritual inquiry. It's a very different conception to what we might find elsewhere. And if we were to ask you to sum up the discussion we've had today in like one sentence, right? So if everyone's fallen asleep and they've just woken up now, how would you summarize our discussion, the key takeaways in one sentence?
Maybe I'd say this, that so the topic for this evening was, is there a God? It's a bit more than a sentence, but the topic for this evening was, is there a God?
Yeah.
Does God exist? And I would say that that's a good question to ask, but you might want to start by asking a question that will hopefully take you further than that question. And that question is, what is consciousness and the nature of consciousness? That's one thing. But the second thing is that, what is the nature of matter? So there are a lot of arguments about, how do you know about consciousness? Do we know it exists? You don't know what it is. Does God exist? But let me pose this to you, which will hopefully sit with you for a little while till you figure it out, is that my assertion is we don't even know what the nature of matter is. Forget about the nature of consciousness. So let's leave aside consciousness. We don't know what the nature of matter is. So given that we've had so many millennia of trying to understand matter, if we don't understand, and we don't understand the nature of matter, maybe we should have a little bit of humility about how we approach the question in consciousness. Because there's a lot of arrogance out here about kind of like a materialistic, physicalist viewpoint about how spirituality and consciousness and God and all of these things are just up there with the fairies and Santa Claus. But to anyone who's thinking like that, I would say, I would pose a challenge that, well, you explain to me what matter is, and I'll explain to you what consciousness is. And then we can have a conversation. Because, you know, the prerequisite for knowledge and understanding is humility. I have to understand that I don't know before I ask the question about something, or before I'm willing to accept knowledge. Because if I think I know everything, then guess what? There's no point in the conversation. But the fact is that we don't. So that's one for your professors too.
So I want to say a little word about these books. So Nitesh has written 2 books now. When was that one?
2011.
Yeah, so a long while ago. As you know, he has background in like the financial sector, and so one of the things he talks about is, what does an abstract philosophical discussion like this, what does it look like in reality? And in particular, he details one of the frameworks the Gita gives in its 14th, 17th, 18th chapter on the gunas. The gunas are these different ways of understanding how to live in this world, and he does it in a really beautiful way. I think for any of the finance bros in the room, I'd highly recommend that book about how to live a principled life, but also live in the world. And even if one doesn't want to go into the field of finance, I think to actually look at what a framework of spirituality that is tangible and realistic looks like, what it looks like to do something good for the world and not have greed as God, or like this thing that drives capitalism, to have a different principled approach is really, really fascinating, and it's very powerful. So I'd highly recommend that people check out that book. I have personally read it. It's really good. I'd recommend it. And with this new book now, Before Religion, there's a beautiful abstraction of an elephant at the front. How many of you have heard of like the 6 blind men and an elephant? Yeah? These kind of blind guys trying to figure out what an elephant is. So they go and like touch different parts of it. And then one guy touches the tail and he's like, ooh, it's like a snake. Another person touches the kind of main body and says an elephant's like a wall. And then the other guy goes, no, you're absolutely wrong. And he's feeling the leg of the elephant. He says an elephant's like a pillar. And in that, what you realize is, because people have limited understandings, if they don't have a concept of an elephant, then they're only going to be able to understand different elements of reality. And although everyone's experience is absolutely valid, they can have different truths that work together. And then based off that kind of simple analogy, it goes on to a very beautiful exploration of understanding what spirituality really means in a very rational and precise manner. What does it mean to explore divinity, karma, time, and actually a spiritual quest for a spiritual seeker? This is a really good book on how to navigate that journey. I've read it about 2.5 times now, so I'm doing my 3rd read of it. It's really, really good, and I'd really recommend it. So I'd highly recommend that you check out these books. I believe you're going to stay here at the front. So if you want your book signed, please come over here, speak to Nitesh. I'm sure he'll love to answer your questions on both books. The books we've asked for a very small price for each. Student discount prices, so the actual price is a little bit more, but Nitesh has been very kind for all of you here. The price is only there so that you take the book very seriously and understand it, because actually the wisdom here is priceless. So if you're going to go based off value, we'd have to empty your pockets out. But we're going to be very kind to you. We're going to say £10 for Before Religion. It's very, very cheap. And then £5 for the Dharma of Capitalism. Personally, I think those are a little bit too cheap, but Nitesh is very kind. So he's not an economist, I guess. He doesn't really know how to utility maximize in the same way we would. But I would really recommend that you actually get them. So £10 and £5. Thank you so much.
We give him that.